Right. Well, thanks everyone for coming. I'm really excited to to be able to give this presentation, and thanks to Willie, the SRS, for inviting me. It's a pleasure. So I'm going to talk about my trip to Nepal. I went to Nepal last year, exactly this time last year. It was an absolutely fantastic trip. So I'm going to share with you what we came across along the way, really treading in the footsteps of Joseph Hooker. So first of all, I'd just like to acknowledge everyone that helped to make the trip happen. David and Stella Rankin, first of all, for inviting me to join them on the trip. It was an incredible place to go, and I'm very grateful for them for organising the trip. And to the amazing guides and porters who supported us throughout the whole trip. They were absolutely incredible, and everyone else who joined. It was great to be able to share the experience with other people. It was a lovely team. And last but not least, the Scottish Rhododendron Society for their support, the Education and Exploration Fund, without which I wouldn't have been able to go on a trip like this. And also to the Scottish Rock Garden Club, the Alpine Garden Society, the Colgrave Seabrook Foundation, and the Stanley Smith Horticultural Trust. It's incredible, to be in a community where we have all of these organisations and societies that are able to support people. As I said, I wouldn't have been able to do anything like this without that. So, thank you very much. So, Nepal, of course, stretches from east to west, about 800 kilometres in length. It's home to 8 of the world's tallest mountains, all over the height of 8,000 metres, including the world's tallest, of course, Mount Everest, Sagarmatha, which is 8,849 metres tall, and Kanchenjunga, which is Nepal's second tallest mountain and the world's third tallest. The area we actually went to was in the very far northeast of Nepal, as you can see there. And this is the Kanchenjunga Conservation Area, which was designated as a conservation area in 1998. Basically, because it's such an incredibly biodiverse area. It stretches from lowland, subtropical, tropical flora right up to high alpine, and due to the topography, it's one of the most biodiverse areas in Nepal. So, Mount Kanchenjunga, you can see here, the tallest peak on the right-hand side is 8,586 metres tall. It's the third tallest mountain in the world, as I said. And the name is actually derived from the Tibetan, Kanchenjunga, which is interpreted as the 5 treasures of the Great Snow. It's a sacred mountain, so actually no one who climbs it is allowed to stand upon its peak. It's one of the few mountains where you're not allowed. So our route, we started after a flight from Kathmandu over to Badrapur Airport in the southeast of Nepal. We then took a pretty unpleasant ride in a 4x4, 2 days travel north to basically where the road ended, up at a place called Sekatum, down in the bottom left of the screen there. That was about 1,500 metres in altitude. We then trekked through tropical woodlands, temperate montane forest, and right up into high alpine meadows by the end. And as I said, it's just an incredibly diverse flora, and that's really owing to the topography of the landscape and the changing climatic conditions along the way. So wonderful to see such a range of plants and different biomes throughout the area. Oh, lovely, thank you. So we started at Sekatum. This is the first guest house we stayed at, just for one night, and this is where we met our porters. So from left to right, we have Lakpa Sherpa, Pemba Sherpa, Lakpa again, Renzin Sherpa, Dawa Sherpa, and Ramesh Sherpa on the right. And they were just amazing. They did the whole trek in in sandals, and and I mean they were, they trekked off with our bags and they were gone, and we never saw them again until we arrived. They were amazing. The trek began through this beautiful gorge following the Ghunsa River north, starting at an altitude of around 1,600 meters. So at this point, the vegetation was subtropical. There was bananas, unfortunately none ripe enough to eat. This beautiful orchids. This is a tiny dendrobium. The flowers are no bigger than my thumbnail, and lots of epiphytic, lithophytic begonias as well. We came across this lovely clematis. This is Clematis cornata. Lots of agapetes growing epiphytically from the trees. And this lovely thing on the right-hand side, this is Utricularia cumaunensis, which absolutely covered the rocks alongside the gorge, growing amongst the moss with the water splashing upon it. It was absolutely, it's like a jewel across the rock faces. And pretty soon we came across our first rhododendron. This is Rhododendron arboreum. This is a really quite low elevation one, about 1,700 meters. And another form of arboreum. It was amazing to see the diversity of different forms of these plants, which in cultivation it's hard to really sort of understand how much they kind of vary. But when you see these two things growing side by side, you might be fooled into thinking that they're a completely different species. Accompanied by the rhododendrons was a whole host of other ericaceous plants. So we had Lyonia, Avalifolia, lots of Gaultherias, agapetes, as I've said, and lots of vacciniums as well. On the very first day, I was extremely excited to come across this. This is a really rare orchid. It's a species, it's in a genus all of its own, Anthogonium gracili, which I'd cultivated at Kew when I worked there from one of Kingdon Ward's original collections. And it's the only one we saw on the whole trip in flower. It was absolutely lovely to see that growing lithophytically on a rock. So by the end of the first day, we reached Ambulosa Camp. Beautiful area. This is where we first saw Pinus wallichiana growing there. You can see throughout the talk, you'll see the elevation maps at the end of each day on the bottom right there. So the first day we covered about 16 kilometres on foot. That was a good taste of what was to come. And this is when we started checking our blood O2 levels. We were at 2,400 metres at this point, so checking our blood levels throughout the trip was really important. General advice is to only climb about 500 metres per day, but due to just the area we were in, this wasn't always possible, so we were often having to go further than that, sometimes 700 metres up in altitude, and it of course has a toll on your body. You start, your blood O2 levels drop, your heartbeat rises, etc. So it was really important to monitor that. We then trekked to a lovely place called Gyabla, again following the Ghunsa River up to about an altitude of 2,700 metres. We had pretty torrential rain whilst we stayed there, but it did mean that the next morning the valleys just looked lovely and lush, and already the vegetation was really quite obviously beginning to change and become more temperate. We came across some familiar plants. This is Sarcococca hookeriana, lovely to see that in the wild for the first time, and some more unusual things. This lovely thing in the middle is Lobelia seguinii, an absolutely beautiful plant, and this is Rubus nepalensis on the right hand side, occasionally offering us a nice berry to eat along the way. They were absolutely delicious. And about 2,500 metres we came across another rhododendron. This is Rhododendron lepidotum, and this was probably the most variable of the rhododendrons I saw throughout the trip. I didn't know what it was when I first came across this. Thankfully, the guys from the SRS helped me to identify it when I came back. We had the seed pod on it there as well. A flower would have been very helpful. And now, bordering on the temperate zone, we found all sorts of interesting epiphytes. And this is actually Hedychium growing epiphytically on a huge oak tree. This is Hodicium spicatum. And we came across our first Primula capitata in flower, and these, from then on, they just followed us all up the paths. It was lovely to have those along the way. And we came across lots of lovely other things. This is Aconitum hemsleyanum, a really lovely deep maroon colour form. Codonopsis gracilis, just hanging in the shrubs around us. And this is a lovely Edgeworthia, not hardy to grow in this country. This is Edgeworthia gardneri in bud. Unfortunately not in flower yet, but still a beautiful thing. And still quite close to the river. The flora was becoming very obviously more temperate at this point. This is Acecamp bellii, growing out over the river roaring below. And finally, we, at a bit higher altitudes, we came over this distinct form of Arboreum, subspecies Cinnamomum. And it was interesting for me that we only found this form at higher altitudes. We never saw any Cinnamomum sort of below about 2,500 meters, and it was predominantly this form higher up. Just beautiful looking up into the forests of this rhododendron, backlit by the sun. It's absolutely beautiful. So we had a lovely hike up to Gebla. We were now at an altitude of 2,700 meters. And it was about 14 kilometers in distance to there. It was a really scenic little hamlet, and really stunning views of the valley. I just sat here admiring this waterfall for quite some time. The silhouettes of the Tuga de Mosa on the ridge of the peaks beyond as well, and the mist flowing through. It was a lovely place. Next morning we readied ourselves. This is our porters, each carrying 2 of our bags each. We just had our little day packs on, so we didn't have to worry too much about that. But as you can see, just hiking through these mountains in sandals, and they set off before us, and I think they just wanted to get to the next camp as soon as they could, and then they could rest their legs. It suddenly felt much more temperate here, and we came across this amazing gentian relative, again another one that was new to me, Helenia elliptica, with sort of these almost berberis looking flowers. Of course, the distinct bark of Betula utilis glowing in the woodland really stood out. And some, just 1 or 2, unfortunately, plants of Paris polyphylla in fruit. Very, very rare now, even in this conservation, protected area, because they're dug up for medicinal use. Often, for China, they're really quite valuable.
Any reason for that?
They're just of very high value for medicine. So we saw very few, unfortunately. Daphne bollowa was almost a weed. It was just growing alongside the paths. It's self-seeding everywhere. If only we could grow it as easily here. Lovely Gualtheria numularia here, a huge specimen, just tumbling down this wet rock face. And some marvellous trees. This is a really old specimen of Juniperus recurva. Me stood at the base of it there. And this area was quite obviously, possibly because of the tree, sort of a sacred area. It had Tibetan prayer flags all around it, and it was a beautiful thing to see. As we gained elevation further, came across Rhododendron thomsonii, really distinct rounded leaves, and we found the really sort of telltale the large calyces left behind after it had flowered, and the lovely reddish brown bark on the trunks there. And it was great seeing them all growing side by side. There's a mixture of Rhododendron arboreum and thomsonii here along the path. And after a 10-kilometre hike, we approached the town of Ghunsa at an altitude of 3,400 metres. Thankfully, we found the right bridge across the river. Not this rather confused goat just stood there bleating, hoping someone would help him. Our beach hut style accommodation was quite nice. It was pretty cold up at this altitude, as you can imagine. Pretty dramatic mountains around us. But we did have a lovely warm a dining cut to stay in with a log burning stove, which was much appreciated. And yeah, it was this area. It was just like walking into going back in time. This village was just lovely and peaceful. This is one of the prayer wheels. The farm animals. It's just as it's always been, I imagine.
Yeah.
So the next day we were supposed to have a rest, but we decided to hike up one of the nearby peaks. Fortunately not that one. Definitely not that one. The slopes were absolutely covered with a patchwork of dwarf shrubs, including another rhododendron lepidotum, this time with much smaller leaves than we'd seen before, and I thought they were two completely different things at first. Came across our first Edelweiss, Leontopodium jacotianum, and a tapestry of other alpine shrubs along the way. And at the top I came across a strongly scented rhododendron anthopogon, which I never knew how strongly scented this shrub was before one of our guides showed it to us and explained that it was used for medicinal purposes in Nepal, as well as for its use as incense as well. And later on the day, we had some time to ourselves, so I wandered out of the village and explored one of the nearby areas, and I found some flowers, which was lovely. So on the left, we've got Rhododendron setosum in flower. In the middle, one of the lepidotums in flower, and on the right, the tissue-like flowers of Rhododendron anthopogon. And this area was amazing. I found such a diversity of rhododendrons all in one small space. On the right here is Cinnabarinum, and on the left, and on the right is Rhododendron wolitchii. And another short video here. This was just the most beautiful place. This stream was just glistening with the sort of very fine sand-like silt at the bottom of it that had been washed down from the mountains. And just an amazing range of rhododendrons. That was an incredible place. So then the next day, after a little bit of a rest, we walked up to a place called Kanchenjunga, again further up in altitude. The forests were very temperate at this point, and mainly composed of the conifers, Tsugudamosa. We've got Larix griffithii on the left there, Betula utilis. This is a really nice old trunk of Abies spectabilis. And in fact, the last tree we saw coming up into the Alpine zone, standing right on its own on the moraine of a glacier, was a specimen of Betula utilis, actually. That was the very last tree we saw at about 4,000 meters in altitude. Another lovely specimen of Rhododendron lepidotum there. So this is when we got first sight of one of the terminal moraines of a glacier. This is the Janu Glacier, which you can see the path just winding across there, which we had to cross. But on our way, I came across probably one of the most interesting shrubs, in my opinion. This is a hippophae, a sea buckthorn. This is Hippophae tibetana, and it's known to be one of the highest growing alpine shrubs in the world, having been found up to altitudes of 5,200 meters. It's a lovely little thing, with, of course, a telltale sea buckthorn, the bright orange berries. I didn't try one. I regret not trying one of the berries, but it was soon then to traverse the terminal moraine of the glacier, and to put it in one word, it was bleak. It was thick fog was setting in, and the air was bitterly cold, but there were some lovely things along the way. Despite the conditions, the flora was fantastic. We saw Cassiope fastigiata there, and again loads more rhododendrons in flower. All of the dwarf rhododendrons we saw along the way, some salix, etc. And once over the moraine, we came across our first gentians in some alpine meadows. So on the left is Gentiana ornata, not open just because it was such a foggy day. They'd closed up. But then I came across the only specimen of Gentiana depressa. Lovely thing to find. It was growing on a vertical slope right next to one of the streams coming from the glacier, right in amongst this Cotoneaster microphylla. Purely sort of growing out of this vertical face. Beautiful thing. So we'd covered around 15 kilometres that day, and we'd climbed over 600 metres in altitude to around 4,084 metres, but we couldn't. It was the fog was so thick we couldn't see the cabin barely. And it was only when we woke up the next morning that we realised what we'd missed around us, because the snow-capped peaks were just incredible. The blue skies. It was a lovely day. That was quite quite something to wake up to. Yeah. That's. I mean, we came out the cabin and it was just jaw-dropping. The landscape was becoming more and more extreme and more inhospitable to plants and humans, really. Every step, though, just became more spectacular. As we passed through alpine meadows, we came across some lovely clumps of Cynopodophyllum hexandrum, which is something I'd always thought was a woodland plant, but here it was growing over 4,000 metres in altitude, alpine meadows. The yaks had obviously avoided grazing on it. And it had its lovely sort of plum-like fruits hanging off it. We saw a few Mechanopsis. This is Mechanopsis grandis in fruit. And by this point, Gentiana ornata was just everywhere. We had to almost avoid stepping on it. It was just covered the floor. And the valleys were just amazing, carved out by ancient glaciers. Of course, despite the altitude, there was some animal life, and we saw these herds of blue sheep on the mountains beside us, which was lovely. And eventually, after a long day's hike, we reached the terminal glacier of the Kanchenjunga glacier, and this is the glacier we'd be skirting along to reach Pangpema base camp for views of Mount Kanchenjunga. Along the way, though, I snapped this picture really quickly, not thinking much of it, and then later realised it's another gentian. This is Gentiana stellata, and it's the only one I saw on the trip, so I'm quite glad I took a quick picture of that. And then this is a site I've always dreamt of seeing. This is the end of the glacier with the meltwater. It's something I'll never forget. And it wasn't bright white and shining as I'd imagined a glacier to be honest. It was covered in debris from the surrounding mountains, but it was pretty spectacular. Now, really close to our next camp, we crossed the river just near to the glacier, and again we came across some more lovely plants. This is Saxifraga Andersonii, identifiable by the seed pods that it still had on it. And we came across this lovely asterid in flower. This is Aladia glabra. We at last arrived at this place called Lonak. It was a pretty miserable place to stay. I can say, the conditions were pretty harsh, but the scenery was incredible. And well, I have to say at this point I had an absolutely splitting headache. The altitude was not easy, but it was one of the most dramatic landscapes I've ever seen in my life. I half expected Gollum to come crawling around the corner. So this is the camp. It had log burning stoves, although they were pretty useless because they were powered by yak dung, which, I mean, it was barely warm enough to dry a damp tissue, so we were freezing cold. But anyway, the next morning we set off, and this was the day that we'd hopefully get views of Mount Kanchenjunga. We set off, and it was thick fog, which was really, we were quite worried about, but it did give us some atmospheric views of the blue sheep in the distance. And then the fog began to clear. We could look down upon the glacier, and just, we could hear it occasionally, the odd creak coming from the glacier below. But the plants that were growing along here were absolutely fascinating, and we came across this golden edelweiss, Leontopodium monocephalum, just beautiful and perfectly adapted to the harsh environment. You can see the substrate it's growing in, which is, granitic sand, essentially. It was very, very loose. We definitely didn't want to get too close to the edge of the glacier. As we skirted the glacier, we saw some fantastic mountains. This is, aptly named Wedge Peak, Chang Himal, and this is at an altitude of 6,802 meters at the top. It's pretty much unclimbable because it really is a knife's edge at the top, and we could actually see sort of shards of ice forming on the summit from where we were standing. As we continued, we were hoping we'd get views of Mount Kanchenjunga, and we kept going. We still couldn't see it, and our guides actually called it the Shy Mountain because it's really only up until you get, you need to get right up to the base camp, and then it suddenly appears. It's pretty much hidden from view anywhere else, and there it is. That's a view I'll never forget. So that's the summit at the top right there, with the clouds and, the snow being blown off it by the strong winds. It was at once actually thought to be the highest mountain before K2 and Mount Everest were accurately measured. And but from where I'm standing there, it's another 3,400 meters to the top, so I don't fancy that. Yeah, beside it are the twin peaks, Gimigala Chula, the tallest of which is 7,350 meters, and literally just behind that is Sikkim. Those mountains sit right on the border. This is the team at Pangpema base camp. We were glad we'd made it there. We were incredibly lucky with the weather. Really, pretty much clear views of the mountain behind. And just a quick video. Again, it's we stayed for some time, of course, just in awe of the place, really. We didn't want to, we hiked all the way up there. We didn't want to just turn around straight away. Yeah. And but I mean, right up here, there was still plenty of plants growing, I have to say. There was we found Mechanopsis horridula in fruit, something I've wanted to see, ever since sort of reading about it in Kingdon Ward's books. There was this asteroid I haven't identified, but in flower, this was at 5,100 meters, and a very, very dwarf form of rhododendron anthopogon. That was pretty much the only rhododendron you could find at these altitudes, but pretty much covering the ground. And after a final night at Lonak, we headed all the way back down to Ghunsa. So we trekked 22.5 kilometers back down. It was a really hard hike, thankfully downhill for most of the way. But we did come across this lovely, another Mechanopsis along the way. This is Mechanopsis discidura, with its really quite unique seed pods with that sort of pinky purple disc at the top. And we had amazing weather. I mean, this is just a view of one of the Gentiana ornatas with the sacred Janu peak behind it. We spotted a rhododendron in flower finally, one of the larger ones, and this was Rhododendron cinnabarinum in flower. It was beautiful, just these lovely soft red flowers, which we'd walked straight past on the way up and not noticed this, so it was quite nice. You always see things on, that you've missed on the way back down. Yes, yeah. So once back at Ghunsa, we now felt pretty comfortable with the altitude. Actually, we'd pretty much acclimatized, which was a relief, and we were preparing for another high altitude hike over the Selele Pass, and this would take us over to the next valley, and then we'd hike up to see the south face of Mount Kanchenjunga. We were met by amazing Abies spectabilis forests along the way. And there were beautiful groves of Rhododendron hodgsonii. It was the only tree in the forests not absolutely covered with moss, and they really stood out. Beautiful to see those. The autumn colours were amazing. This is Sorbus microphylla with a pretty unbeatable backdrop. And the slopes again were just covered with a tapestry of plants with the autumnal hues coming along. There's sort of reds and pinks of Persicaria popping up through there, a range of rhododendron species again. And as we approached the first ridge, again we found some more familiar plants, Bigenia purpurescens, and then some more unusual things, a lovely Cyananthus pedunculatus there, which was quite common along the ridges, and another Rhododendron lepidotum in flower. The landscapes were extremely, were pretty barren looking, but actually, walking along the paths, they weren't barren at all. They were full of life, actually. We finally arrived at the Selele guest house. This is one of the first passes of the Selele, and this is what I measured to be around 4,200 meters. Actually, I think this altitude is a bit optimistic. I had my GPS tracker with me. At this point, I think that the altitude must have gotten to me because I decided to have a quick dip in this stream. I thought I'd regret it if I didn't. It was pretty refreshing, I have to say. I didn't stay in there for too long, as you can imagine, but it was beautiful. It was really nice. And we slept well, and the next day it was a hard day's hike over 3 passes, but through some of the most dramatic scenery. It was unfortunately pretty cloudy throughout the day, but even so. So we journeyed over 3 passes, as I said. The Selele, which is 4,620 meters. The Merginla, similar height, 4,642 meters. And finally, the Sinalapchala Pass at 4,708 meters. So it was a day at pretty high altitude, before really quickly descending about 800 meters straight down to a small settlement called Seram. And this is somewhere one of the areas that Hooker passed through, and in fact it was in this place that Hooker made the first record of Mount Everest by a European. On the second pass we passed through, he made this sketch, and in the distance you can actually see Mount Everest there. Unfortunately, the weather wasn't on our side, so it was a good job it wasn't cloudy when Hooker was there, but even so, pretty amazing. And we came across some incredible alpine plants, really iconic to see. Caesoria gossipifera, with the wonderful flowers completely covered with the sort of candy floss-like hairs to protect them from the elements. And a new one to me, this Apiaceae, this Umbellifer Courtiella hookeri, which was just absolutely flat to the ground in full flower. A beautiful thing, which I've never seen before. I doubt that you would be able to grow that in cultivation. And reaching the end of the pass, we got this spectacular view of the Yalung Glacier. And we'd be skirting the edge of this glacier, as I said, to see the south face of Mount Kanchenjunga the next day. So we headed straight down to the settlement of Seram, and we gave our legs a good rest. The next day we regrouped and headed towards the Yalung Glacier. It was a long hike ahead of us, and to be honest, the flora in this area was pretty, wasn't very diverse. We just kept our heads down and went for it. It was a really hard day. It was mainly dwarf junipers. There was lots of rhododendron Dasyphora fruticosa or Potentilla fruticosa, and the odd gentian mixed in for good measure as well. There's these funny huts we passed, which had been insulated with yak dung. Hopefully they didn't smell too bad inside. And we eventually neared Oktang base camp, from where we'd get views, hopefully, of the south side of Mount Kanchenjunga. Just amazing glaciers. We finally made it, and thankfully, just before some heavier cloud came in, we got some views of the south side of the peak there. It was here that our reporters actually started to collect some rhododendron to take home with them. This being a sacred place, it has an important meaning for them, and so they wanted to take some home to burn as incense. And it does have a really lovely smell. It's quite sort of a medicinal kind of sweet smell to it. So then it was finally time to head back down the mountains. On the way down, we passed through some of the most lovely temperate forests, and really, I was really glad to see this Prunus rufa along the way. I hadn't seen that anywhere else on the trip. At first, quite easy to get confused with that and Betula utilis. The bark is very similar, but here you can see that the leaves are reasonably easy to distinguish from, although from a distance they look very similar.
That would be a fair altitude. Was it not?
Yeah, that was around 4,000 meters still. Oh, nice. So coming down to sort of 4,000, 3,500 meters there. And there was a really good diversity of rhododendrons here. This is Rhododendron fulgens with its really dense felty indumentum. But beautiful montane forests of Abies vectabilis and Tsugademosa hemlock. Below which were growing hydrangeas, Hydrangea heteromala there, and again more Rhododendron thomsonii. Rhododendron barbatum with the telltale barbs on the petioles. And just to confuse us, Rhododendron barbatum without any barbs.
Used to be called Inverdi.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, when you're out here and you see these things growing together, as I said, it's you can see why things have been given different names in the past, because they are really quite distinct. We saw some really distinct forms of arboreum, and this is a form that I believe Hooker originally described as Rhododendron lancifolium, which is now arboreum. And you can, as I say, you can really see why when you're out in the field. And again, another really unusual form of Rhododendron arboreum. Really dark leaves. This is obviously quite young, so I don't know whether it's going to retain that colour as it grows older, but it was lovely. The forests were amazing. Just the river roaring through, constant sort of soundtrack throughout the trek, and the mountain air was good. I came across Tricertis maculata, which I'd completely forgotten it grows here. This is the most westerly distribution of the whole genus. There's this beautiful climbing gentian, Crawfordia speciosa, and another Codonopsis viridis, just growing, often twining its way up bamboo canes and just hanging beside the paths along the way. And we finally came across some Rhododendron falconeri, which we'd seen nowhere else on the trip. It was amazing how many different species you'd find on different mountains in different areas, and you'd see them nowhere else. Impressive enough without the flowers, just beautiful leaves. And as we lowered in altitude, signs of life, of human life, become apparent. More settlements and farming, across the mountains. The subtropical vegetation, the humidity, the heat started to come, and we were nearing the end of the trek. These are our 3 guides who took us along the way. They were absolutely amazing. They kept us in really good spirits. They kept us smiling, laughing along the way. So on the left is Renzen. In the middle, Swakendra, and on the right is Dorche. Just fantastic people. And we trekked back down to the town of Helok at 1,500 meters. We got into the jeep, and then it was another 2-day drive back to Bhadrapur, on awful roads. That was the most unpleasant part of the trip by far. And then a plane back from Bhadrapur to Kathmandu. For me, it wasn't actually time to come home. I actually had to fly to Vietnam straight after that because I had field work to carry out in Vietnam for Q. So it was a very long trip for me. Thankfully, I had a few days in between to have a rest. So in total, we covered 170 kilometers on foot. We climbed 3,640 meters in altitude, from around 1,500 meters up to a maximum altitude of 5,173, across 12 days. It was an intense trip. It was incredible. I mean, all of those words. It was something I'll never forget. And
an Ironman feat.
yeah. I certainly well, I'm already quite slim, but I came away from it even slimmer, and with good strong legs and lungs after that. It was Thanks very much.
Thank you, Richard. Have you any questions for Richard?
What camera you were using?
Oh, I have a little, on these trips, I like to use this little Canon digital camera. I'll get the name for it for you. It's a fantastic little thing. I don't like taking, large sort of bulky things around with me. Knowing me, I'd drop a lens or something. But yeah, it's great for these kind of things. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
You keep saying as you get higher and higher, you have altitude sickness and that sort of thing.
Oh yeah.
Do you feel dramatically better as you start getting down?
Oh, quickly, yes, yeah. So I had pretty bad altitude sickness, I have to say. Once we got up to Lonak, and that was about 4,800 meters in altitude. The morning that we were supposed to climb up to see the view of Mount Kanchenjunga, I honestly wasn't sure if I would be able to go. I was sat in the morning with my head in my hands, barely able to lift a spoon to my mouth to eat breakfast. And they checked my blood O2 levels, and my oxygen levels were about 60, which is low. So they were pretty worried about me. Our guides gave me a drink of ginger and lemon tea, and I have to say it really helped. That's their sort of remedy. And after 10-15 minutes, I did start to feel a bit better, and I just pushed on actually, and I was okay in the end. But it was tough, and but it doesn't matter how fit you are, it can affect anyone, and. I'm certainly not the kind of person that would push on at the expense of my own health. I was very ready to say, actually, I'll go back down to the next camp if I wasn't feeling ready. But yeah, as soon as we got back down to Ghunsa, for example, which was another 1,500 odd meters down, we felt loads better. It was we were at over 3,000 meters in altitude at that point, but we'd really gotten used to it. Yeah.
Was the University of Kerala
isolated, or was it in a group?
Oh, it was quite. It was pretty. It was pretty dense in areas actually. So right from, I suppose, from about 2,500 to 3,000 meters, right up to just under 4,000 meters. It was pretty widespread across that sort of altitude. Yeah.
And the Bachelor Utilis, is that an individual, or is again that widespread?
Again, quite widespread. In fact, the Bachelor Utilis, as soon as we started seeing it, we saw it right through. And as I said, it was the last tree we actually saw it was at the highest altitude tree that we'd. Yes, yeah, exactly, yeah.
The whole area you were in is part of the National Forest, isn't it?
It is, yeah. So it's all protected.
It's quite rich flora, thankfully, it's still untouched.
Absolutely.
Compared to other talks I've seen on Nepal, they always tell you about Nepal, how the forest is depleted, and I think in the Everest area,
in
places like that. So it was
Yeah, it was
Really
wonderful
good.
to see how intact the forests were, I have to say, and it felt, you know, I imagine it wasn't too different when Hooker was there, to be honest.
Well, it looked lush.
You know, and it's the type location for many of those rhododendron species. Is where many of those were first discovered. So it was great to see them, you know, in their type location.
We hear a lot about glaciers in Europe, the skiing,
Oh yeah.
South America. What's the present status of the glaciers in this area?
I think they are slowly receding, but I don't think they're as at risk as our glaciers in Europe. I mean, it's at such an altitude here that I suppose there's more of a buffer zone, and you know, a lot of them are really quite surrounded by the mountains. So I suppose you know, with permanent snow on them. So yeah, it's not as much of an issue, but it's still.
No more questions? Well, what can I say, Richard? Thank you very much for showing us that, you know, these fabulous ranges of mountains and your pictures and everything. And the only last thing I would say is Matt and I should probably go and probably lose a wee bit of weight up. Can we all thank Richard?